My name is Ashok. I am an advocate by profession. I run a small law firm called Corlett Legal. Crux of my practice is actually in the field of commercial litigation, but I actually work with Enforce Proactive Health Trust to assist victims of child sexual abuse and also to do training and capacity building programs for law enforcement. So my work actually begins by helping them lodge the police complaint, then probably meeting with the prosecutor, explaining to them what the case is, and then helping them understand what is child sexual abuse, what are the dynamics that govern child sexual abuse, what are the kind of evidences that can be presented. That is one part of my work. The other part of my work is, of course, doing the training and capacity building program for law enforcement. So what I do is I basically work with the government agencies like the Department of Women and Child Development and travel across the state and take classes for police, district child protection officials, lawyers, social workers on how exactly one can handle these cases and basically see to it that the victim gets justice. Absolutely. I think if I have to reflect on some of my training sessions, the kind of response from the law enforcement has been very positive. There is definitely a lot of interest in taking some of these cases forward. There's a lot of interest in making sure that the child is not traumatized. There is definitely a sense of anxiety among law enforcement that they don't want to make mistakes while investigating these cases. So there is a lot of good intentions, there is a lot of will out there. It's just about supplying the right infrastructure and support, which is where the social sector can get involved. Reporting is still a problem for many reasons. While there is a lot of positive intentions among law enforcement, the capacity to really address these cases on a war footing does not exist. So what happens is that repeated adjournments are inevitable. There aren't enough court halls. Everybody is overburdened. So that one-on-one personal attention becomes very difficult. So as a result, there is no absolute guarantee that reporting will mean conviction. So in addition to that, we always have to remember that most of the cases of child sexual abuse that we come across involve incest, which means that the offender is somebody within the family. So there is a fear of breaking up the family if the mother does not want to report her husband, because then there is a question of maintenance. And these are some areas which have not been adequately addressed by legislation or by the executive. So as a result, people are still very hesitant to report it, and this is in addition to the existing stigma that we associate with child sexual abuse. So yes, ideally there should have been more reporting, but there is a steady increase. POCSO has a very interesting history, so to say. The Indian government actually signed the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child somewhere in 1994. And one of the international obligations that India undertook at that time was to bring in a specific legislation which will address the subject of child sexual abuse. Unfortunately or fortunately, the legislation came only in 2012 in the form of Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, or what we call as POCSO. So prior to 2012, all cases of child sexual abuse, depending upon the nature of abuse, came within the provisions of the Indian Penal Code. Now, if you look at the Indian Penal Code and say the definition of rape under Indian Penal Code and definition of penetrative sexual assault under the POCSO, there is not material difference between the two. But prior to 2013, which was when the IPC was also amended, rape or the provision of rape covered only non-consensual penile-vaginal intercourse, whereas concepts like say oral intercourse or anal intercourse still came within the purview of 377, and non-penetrative sexual assault came within the purview of 354. Now, conventional legislation always places the burden on the prosecution to prove the offence occurred beyond reasonable doubt. So therefore, there was an enormous amount of onus on both the victim as well as the prosecution effort itself to show that the person who is accused has committed the crime beyond reasonable doubt. So that meant issues like the insufficient evidence being collected, late reporting was a problem, insufficient reporting was a problem. So because of that, even though there was an IPC provision that addressed the problem, it wasn't sufficient to address the specific dynamics that govern child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse is actually a very wide and a very vague term if you actually think about it. So what we need to understand is that child sexual abuse covers a whole plethora of activities, which begins with penetrative sexual intercourse and goes all the way to cover even showing a pornographic clip to a child. So the way the POCSO addresses it is it defines various offences. It begins with defining what is penetrative sexual assault, which is basically for that offence to be proved, what is required is penetration of either the anal cavity or the vaginal cavity or the oral cavity. Now, what defines penetrative sexual assault is penetration, whether it is with the organ of the offender or whether it is with the object or whether it is a digital penetration. And then the act moves on to what is called as sexual assault, which is basically a form of sexual assault that does not involve penetration. So this can be fondling, groping, forcefully, touching the child, things like that. And then there is sexual harassment, which is basically when there might not be any physical contact, but it could be soliciting sexual favors from a child, exposing oneself to the child, showing a pornographic clip to a child, things like that. And then there is use of child in a pornographic film, which is basically what we know as child pornography, which is also another offence under the POCSO. But where POCSO really stands out from the rest of the criminal legislation is in the form of section 19, which is the provision concerning the mandatory reporting. What is mandatory reporting? If I have knowledge or even an apprehension that a child was, is or is likely to be subjected to sexual abuse or any of the offences under the Act, I am duty bound to report it to the Special Juvenile Police Unit. If I don't do that, I am eligible for 6 months imprisonment. So for the first time, the Parliament sent out a clear message that a child is not just the responsibility of the household, but actually the collective responsibility of society at large. And then it goes one step further, because doctors, for example, will express issues of confidentiality. But section 19 also says that if a person has broken a law by disclosing the offence to the Special Juvenile Police Unit or the District Police, no civil or criminal action can be taken against him. So in that sense, POCSO really sets the intention that we want to counteract this problem. When you think of a concept like aggravated sexual assault or aggravated penetrative sexual assault, the Act itself goes into maybe 20 or 25 categories of what constitutes an aggravated version of sexual assault. But if I have to reduce it down to the principle, if there is a power dynamic associated with the abuse, like for example somebody that the child trusts, like the father or the mother or the teacher, or somebody who has power over the child, like for example a warden in a hostel or the warden in an observation home. If the power dynamic is the foundation for the abuse, then it becomes aggravated assault. Or for example, if there is a police officer wearing his uniform or a military man wearing his uniform and he is the person who has committed the abuse, then also it becomes aggravated. If there is use of weaponry during the assault, then it is aggravated. If the child is threatened with harm or injury, then it becomes aggravated. If, for example, the child becomes pregnant as a result of the assault or contracts a sexually transmitted disease, then it becomes aggravated. So like this, it specifies many instances where the nature of the assault itself is very heinous, or where there is a power dynamic associated with the assault, then it becomes aggravated. So for that, under the law, be it with 375 of the Indian Penal Code or with penetrative sexual assault under POCSO, the punishment is always higher because the nature of the crime is a little more grave and serious in nature. The legislative framework is very clear, right? Using a child in a pornographic film is strictly illegal. But the issue becomes a little complicated when you are dealing with teenagers, because their appearance on camera might not be that of a child. So how do we mitigate some of these concerns, especially in an age where internet pornography is so widely accessible? And fact of the matter is that no single country has come back with a clear-cut answer. So today we know that Philippines is a hotbed for child pornography activities. Thailand is a hotbed for child pornography activities. And through some underground channels, you can access these sites wherever you are. But there are reporting mechanisms available online where, for example, if you come across a clip, you can report it. But the rule of caution there is, do not actively search for child pornography, because that might mean that you become suspected of it. So the problem is rampant, but it is largely underground. So we don't know where these pornography films are being shot, where they're being distributed, which are the servers that are hosting the pornography content, where these servers are located. And we are living in an age where servers can be put in an aircraft and flown across international waters. So nobody will know that which country does these servers belong to. So there is a lot of ambiguity or immature understanding of what is the extent of child pornography out there. But what we know now is, if you're dealing with a preferential sex offender who has a preference for a child, then the first thing you need to look for is his laptop, because statistically there is a fat chance that there's child pornography in his laptop, and that can be used to corroborate the case against him. The POCSO does not explicitly say that it is an offense, but a lot of countries, possessing child pornography is considered illegal. When you talk of a concept like, say, child pornography, and is it illegal to possess child pornography, most jurisdictions say that it is illegal to have child pornography. And most jurisdictions, including India, will say that if you're distributing child pornography or any kind of pornographic films, you're going to be caught, imprisoned. Section 66 of the Information Technology Act also makes it illegal. So yes, it would be well advised not to have child pornography against you, because you get into enormous amount of trouble with the law. Couple of things. One is, when you're talking about reporting the offense, the general rule is the earlier the better. So that means if the incident has occurred, the next response should actually be to either go to the local hospital and get medical aid, in which case it becomes a medical legal case and the police is automatically notified, or go straight to the police station and first report the offense. The window period for collecting forensic evidence is actually 72 hours. So from the time of the incident. So with each passing minute, you're losing critical forensic evidence. To give you a simple example, we know now, thanks to medical jurisprudence, that if there are internal injuries, they can heal within a span of few hours. Now tomorrow, if you go to the medical examiner, say 1 week late, and the medical examination report suggests that there isn't any injuries visible on the victim, that then starts to weigh in favor of the accused. So when do you have to report it? As early as possible. But what is the later limit that you need to look at? 72 hours. Having said that, even if you haven't reported within the 72-hour window, that by itself should not become a deterrent, because you can still get a conviction under POCSO if the child's testimony is good enough. This has been held in a number of judgments. Therefore, it is a best practice that we recommend that you report it as early as possible. But even if you report it later than 72 hours, the case is not lost. There is still an effort that has to be made. We are dealing with a law that goes against us when we are talking about bail, because the rule in Indian law is that bail is granted as a matter of rule, and imprisonment is a matter of exception. So how do you prevent a bail from being granted? It is extremely difficult. But how can you do it? One is, of course, to make sure that a proper picture has been presented to the court during the course of bail proceedings. To give you a simple example, in a lot of cases of child sexual abuse where the victim is subjected to a concept called grooming, the victim is not going to be in favor of the prosecution. She is going to turn hostile. So in a lot of cases, while granting bail, the understanding of the judge is, if the victim has turned hostile, that means that there is no offense to be made out. So in that result, they say, okay, this guy is innocent, let's just let him off. How you need to counteract these problems is to make sure that the right material is placed before the court. So if I have to quote my own experience, I strongly rely upon this research paper called Child Molesters, a Behavioral Analysis. This is by Special Agent Kenneth V. Lanning of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He explains in detail under what circumstances abuse occurs, what is grooming, what happens to the victim when there is grooming, under what circumstances she might become hostile. So when the court interprets the hostility of the victim in the right circumstance, the inclination to grant bail reduces. The other way of counteracting the problem is to go back to that earlier principle of how even face-to-face contact can result in intimidation. So you use some of these materials to place before the court and say that, look, conventionally it's okay to say grant bail to when a person is accused of theft, but you're dealing with an altogether different subject governed by an altogether different dynamics, where granting of bail is probably not the best thing to do. So that's how you mitigate the risk of the offender getting bail. What is the weight of the victim's testimony? I won't even say it's a child's testimony, because we can draw some general inferences here. Let us go back a few years. Mathura gang rape case was a very famous case in the Indian judiciary. Using the two-finger test, it was held by the court in that case that a victim who has had repeated intercourse or who is promiscuous cannot be raped. That was more or less the ratio laid on in the judgment. Because there was a lot of protests after that is a wrong conclusion to be drawn by the courts. A lot of things changed in the Indian law. One glaring example of this is State of Punjab versus Gurmeet Singh. This is a Supreme Court judgment. So what State of Punjab versus Gurmeet Singh said is that if the victim's testimony does not have material inconsistencies, then that by itself is sufficient to result in conviction in a rape case. But the important thing is that there should not be material inconsistencies. The court went on to hold that you cannot ask embarrassing questions to the victim during cross-examination, and also held that insofar as corroborating evidence is concerned, like medical examination report, nothing is required as long as there are no inconsistencies in the testimony of the child. So the general rule right now is that if there is a victim's testimony in a criminal case, that is sufficient so long as the victim's testimony does not suffer from inconsistencies. Which is why under section 29 of the POCSO Act, there is a clear rule of law that suggests that in cases of penetrative sexual assault or in cases of sexual assault and the aggravated versions thereof, there is a presumption of guilt unless it is refuted by the defense with good proof. So right now it's the other way around. You no longer have to prove the offense beyond reasonable doubt. The offender has to prove that he is innocent by placing evidence before the court. So a lot of things have changed that way. Absolutely. As I mentioned to you, the Supreme Court in State of Punjab versus Gurmeet Singh has very clearly said that in cases of rape, a victim's testimony, absence material inconsistencies can result in a conviction on its own, and no corroborating evidence is required. But having said that, I have to sound a general caveat here. Yeah, that might be the principle of law, but it is always a matter of sound practice that when you start investigating a case, you look for the widest possible amount and quality of evidence, because the stronger the case is, the better the chances of conviction. The youngest victim that I have dealt with was around 3 years of age at the time of the incident. This was a case of penetrative sexual assault, and this was the time before the POCSO came into the picture. So this was still governed by section 375 of the Indian Penal Code. Now, when we are dealing with a child who is of such a young age that articulating the incident becomes a problem, there are certain ways you can address it. One is, of course, the medical examination report. So to give you an example, there is when a medical examiner examines, say, the vagina of the victim, there are certain signs that is symptomatic of sexual abuse. Now, one of those signs is something that is known as attenuation. So when the hymen is worn out due to attenuation, the conclusion that can be drawn from that is that there is chronic and repeated sexual abuse, right? So it becomes very important that you gather that kind of evidence. Secondly, the mental health diagnosis, which is another critical piece of evidence. Now, when a child is subjected to sexual abuse at that younger age, there is something called as toxic stress that is being inflicted on the child. Now, this toxic stress manifests itself in different ways. It could manifest itself in the form of post-traumatic stress disorder. It could manifest itself into borderline personality disorder. The child could suddenly become very moody and temperamental. The child could exhibit what is called as over-sexualized behavior, which is when the child begins to show sexual behavior which is very atypical of that particular age. So, a diagnosis to that effect by the mental health expert will straight away indicate that there has been some kind of sexual abuse that the child has been subjected to. So, the next question is, once we establish that the child has been sexually abused, who is the offender? So, that is when the investigators can take the help of special educators. These are people who are trained in eliciting information from the child. So, this could be child psychiatrists, social workers, people who are trained in forensic interviews. They can probably sit down with the child and elicit information which can then be translated into a legal statement either before the police or before the 164 magistrate. So, the Act provides for interpreters, special educators, and for their help to be taken to mitigate some of these problems, like the child not being able to articulate it well enough. One of the things that we have noticed while working on this subject of child sexual abuse is that while you have an enactment like POCSO that very clearly talks about child-friendly procedures, in terms of coordination between the various agencies of the government, there is still a lot of work left to be done. Now, for example, when you talk about what is the next step if there is a case reported of child sexual abuse or even if there is an incident. Now, the law very clearly says that the person who is having knowledge or apprehension of the offence has to report it to the Special Juvenile Police Unit or the local police. Now, that aspect is very clear. So, who should you report it to? It is to the Special Juvenile Police Unit. But in a lot of cases, what happens is first the child goes to the hospital. And in fact, it is the doctor who is examining the child who first discovers or appreciates the fact that the child has been sexually abused. Now, in that instance, the mandatory reporting provision casts a duty even upon the doctor to report it to the Special Juvenile Police Unit or the local police. So, who is the first person that you need to go to? Going strictly by the provisions of Section 19, it is the police. But does it mean that simply because you haven't gone to the police, you have gone to somebody else, there is a problem? No, there isn't. Because whoever you go to has to eventually report it to the police. But there are a number of practical issues that come in the wake of it. Now, a complaint is lodged with the police, and if it's a cognizable offence, then the police register what we know as a first information report. Now, the next question is the testimony of the child or the statement of the child has to be recorded. Now, the practical issue with that is that the statement of the child first gets recorded by the police. It gets recorded by the medical examiner when the child is taken for medical examination. And then after all of this, the child, if it is produced before the CWC or the Child Welfare Committee, one more time the child has to disclose what has happened. In addition to all of this, to make sure that the child's testimony is not altered or the child becomes hostile tomorrow, there is a statement taken under section 164 of the Code of Criminal Procedure before the jurisdictional magistrate. So 3 or 4 reporting becomes inevitable. Now, this is how the system is designed in practice, and that repeated recollection of those incidents is actually in itself very traumatic on the child. So, some of the things that we have been trying to do to address that is to have collaborative child response units in hospitals, where once the child goes to the hospital for a medical examination, the entire law enforcement machinery, such as say the police, come there, and there is one disclosure which can then be translated into different statements. But 164 statement before the magistrate has to be taken separately. So these are some things that has to be addressed going forward, because these are the areas of loopholes that haven't been fully covered yet. So as per the Code of Criminal Procedure, a charge sheet is required to be filed within 90 days of the information of the offence being received, failing which the offender is entitled to bail as a matter of right. So you look at it from that perspective, the ideal time frame within which charge sheet has to be filed is 90 days from the date of the offence being reported to the police. But that is a very nice piece of paper called CRPC telling you that, but there are a lot of challenges on the ground. To begin with, the forensic science laboratory is enormously overburdened. So which means that if a sample for DNA testing is submitted today, they are coming back with deadlines of 18 months and 2 years to submit a test report. So which means that the 90-day period for charge sheet filing is just a nice piece of legislation without there being any practical intent. So how soon should the charge sheet be filed? Ideally within 90 days. In certain special circumstances, the forensic science laboratory can expedite the testing. But does it usually happen? Not that I have seen. Having said that, when does a charge sheet get filed? Under the provisions of Code of Criminal Procedure, the investigating officer has to review the evidence that he has collected during the course of the investigation, and if according to him the evidence prima facie discloses a case of child sexual abuse committed by the offender, then only he will file a charge sheet. So if the investigating officer is of the opinion that the evidence is not sufficient enough to prosecute the offender, then he will file what is called as a B report, which is when he wants the court to close the case, right? So it's not in every case of FIR being registered or a complaint being lodged that a charge sheet is filed. It is only when the investigating officer opines that there is sufficient or prima facie evidence to prosecute the offender. To go back to the concept, charge sheet is when the investigating officer feels that there's enough evidence to go after the offender, and B report is when he feels that there isn't enough evidence to go after the offender. So in a B report, he's trying to close the case. In a charge sheet, he's trying to move the case forward. So in the case of a charge sheet, the accused can file what is called as a discharge application, where he says that the charge sheet was incorrectly filed against me, so kindly set it aside. This is before the court which has cognizance of the case. So yes, it can be challenged, but how easy is it to get the charge sheet struck down? It's very difficult, because once a charge sheet is filed, every court is inclined to have a trial, and if he proves himself to be innocent, it's well and good. So they never want to discharge the accused right at the time of filing the charge sheet itself. In the case of a B report, once a B report application is filed by the police official before the court will then issue notice to the person who has given the complaint, saying that the police intend to close the matter. If you have any objections, kindly come forward and place those objections on record. So then the complainant can file what is called as a protest petition. So if you look at, for example, the Arushi Talwar case, where the CBI initially wanted to close the whole matter by filing a B report, the parents actually challenged the closure report, which eventually culminated into a trial. So just because the investigating officer has filed a charge sheet or a B report, it does not end there. You can challenge it before the criminal courts, you can go and writ remedies to the High Court, you can challenge it under section 482 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. So yes, it does not end there. There are many avenues available to challenge either a charge sheet or the B report. One of the conventional problems that was constantly seen in the Indian context was the fact that the policeman would refuse to register the FIR. This was a complaint that we frequently heard. Now POCSO and the IPC came back with provisions to address that issue. So what the POCSO says is that if I am reporting an offence of child sexual abuse, or the likelihood of an offence being inflicted on a child, the policeman is duty bound to record the information, failing which he is also liable for 6 months imprisonment under the POCSO. Now the issue here is that the POCSO does not say that every time you report there has to be an FIR. It only casts a duty upon the police official to record it in writing once the information has been submitted. The reason why the word FIR has not been used is because once the offence is disclosed to the police has to determine whether it is a cognizable offence or a non-cognizable offence. Now, to determine whether it is a cognizable offence or a non-cognizable offence, the defining statute is the Code of Criminal Procedure. Code of Criminal Procedure, the general rule is if the quantum of punishment for the offence is below 3 years, it becomes a non-cognizable case. If a quantum of punishment is above 3 years, it becomes a cognizable offence. Now, going by that standard, once I disclose the offence to the police, he has to first determine whether it is a cognizable offence or a non-cognizable offence. If it is a cognizable offence, he is duty bound as per the CRPC to immediately register an FIR, failure of which will automatically mean proceedings can be initiated against him as per various Supreme Court guidelines. But if it is a non-cognizable offence, they will register what is called as an NCR, after which they have to go to the court and take permission to investigate that offense. So when a POCSO offense is disclosed, the first step is for the policeman to determine what is the quantum of punishment. If the quantum of punishment is more than 3 years, then automatically it's a cognizable offense, FIR is registered. If it is not, then all that he can do is register an NCR and then proceed with the usual channels. Talking about the statement before the police, the rule is that any statement given before the police has no evidentiary value in a court of law except to confront as a contradiction in the course of trial. So if I've given a statement before the police today and I'm saying something different tomorrow, to that extent you can hold the police statement and say that you said that, now why are you changing your statement? But does it have any probative value beyond that? Absolutely none. So the child statement before the police has very little use in the eventual conviction process. What it does is it aids the police in the course of investigation, where to look, who to look at, what kind of injuries do they have to go after, what kind of forensic evidence they have to go after. Child's testimony can give them a direction for investigation, which is why we always say that once you have taken a statement before the police, always make sure that there is a statement before the magistrate under 164 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, because that statement has a lot of probative value. Now this 164 statement becomes very, very important for one reason, and one reason concerning children who are very young, because you have to remember that once the child is subjected to sexual abuse at say the ages of 3, 4 or even 6 or 7, they are immediately brought in touch with a counselor who starts the process of giving therapy. Now during the process of receiving therapeutic counseling, the child's way of coping with the incident is to slowly start forgetting it. So what the counseling does is to make the child forget. Now that is how they put the incident behind and resume their normal life. But if you are looking at a trial that is going to begin 3 years after the incident has occurred, during which time there is also that therapy going on, the child will not remember much to come and say before the court, which is why that 164 statement before the magistrate is your only saving grace. So is the statement before the police sufficient? By no means is it sufficient. You have to go to the magistrate and take that additional statement under 164, particularly in cases of child sexual abuse. What I have noticed is that the reason why there is so much of trust deficit between law enforcement and the civilian population is also to a large extent to do with misplaced expectations. Who is your policeman? He is a creature of the statute. His powers, his duties, his limitations, everything is written by the Karnataka Police Manual, it is written by the Karnataka Police Act, it is written by the Indian Evidence Act, it is written by the Code of Criminal Procedure. Beyond these enactments, he is not entitled to do anything because he is strictly to go by these legislations. So when you look at it from that perspective, you have cases of people going and reporting an offense today and they expect the guy to be arrested by the evening. But they don't realize that the policeman before arresting has to think of many things. So under what circumstance can he arrest an offender? To give you a few instances, if the offense is of a very serious nature, like for example the Nirbhaya case, that was a particularly heinous crime, so then the offender can be arrested. If the intention is to instill a sense of safety in the community, then the policeman can arrest. If there is a fear of the accused escaping or fleeing from justice, then you can arrest him. If there is a fear of the accused reoffending or reoffending against the same victim, then you can arrest the accused. But if all of these factors are not existing and there is no threat of fleeing from justice, there is no general safety implication for the community at large, if we expect the policeman to go and arrest the offender simply because they have lodged a complaint, that is a highly misplaced expectation and the policeman can get into a lot of trouble. And in addition, if the person has got bail, then the policeman can't touch him. And if they do that, then they can get into trouble with the court again. So what I would suggest is that we need to really build a relationship with the law enforcement. Let us understand who these people are. Let us understand what them wearing that uniform means and what they can or cannot do. Because once we have developed a holistic and proper understanding of their powers, we can be a little more fair in how we assess their effectiveness. No, the POCSO is very clear. The child under any circumstance cannot be summoned to the police. The police in fact is required to go to where the child is. This can be the home or any other place where the child feels comfortable, like for example a playground or shopping mall or wherever the child feels comfortable. And it's also very important to note that the policeman cannot be in uniform when they go meet the child. So the idea here is that you do not inflict secondary victimization of the child through the investigative and trial procedures. The POCSO is very clear. When the statement of the child is taken, especially in the cases of girls or teenage girls, it's always a lady police official who manages to record the testimony. The idea here is that a girl might feel more comfortable talking to another girl. There is Delhi High Court decision in Virendra vs. State of Delhi where they say that repeated court appearance of the child is not allowed for. POCSO says that repeated court appearances is not permitted. And recently in 2015, Justice Ronita Nariman of Supreme Court came back with a verdict where he said that the cross-examination of a witness in a criminal trial has to happen on the same day the examination is concluded. Maximum 1 or 2 days leeway can be given, but nothing beyond that. So in principle, you are not supposed to call the child beyond maximum 1 or 2 times. But in practice, I have had cases where my child has been called 6 times, 7 times across the span of 6-7 months. So that's again to do with the lack of awareness among all levels of law enforcement. When you, I think more than child-friendly courts, the more appropriate term would be child-friendly procedures. So if you look at some of the way the procedures applied for adult victims, there is a lot of difference compared to how things are supposed to go with the child. So for example, as I said, repeated calling of the child to testify is not allowed for. The child is entitled to have a parent, a guardian, or anybody he or she trusts to be present during all procedures. The child cannot be asked embarrassing questions. The child cannot be asked intimidating questions. In fact, the prosecution or the defense cannot ask questions directly to the child. They have to compile their questions in writing, present it to the judge, and the judge will then present that to the child in a non-threatening, non-embarrassing manner. So when you say and the child and the accused are not supposed to come in face-to-face contact with each other, the child is to be given as many breaks as the child wants. So that is what child-friendly procedures refer to. But in practice, what we have seen is that even though face-to-face contact, for example, is not allowed with the accused, what happens is that until the case is called out, they're sitting next to each other, the accused and the child, and then when the case is called out that the child has to testify, somebody puts in a screen, which is absolutely preposterous. So that's what child-friendly court is, one that follows child-friendly procedures. But is that happening? Where is the infrastructure for it? So in terms of what needs to be done, it's not about changing laws, it's about investing into the infrastructure necessary to enforce existing laws. There is provision for interim compensation. This is provided by the government, but the nature of protocols and the kind of documentation that is required to take that compensation is so elaborate and so cumbersome that in practice the whole notion of interim compensation or interim relief is completely without teeth. So while it is there on paper, how many of them are able to easily have access to it? I would say less than 1%. Depending upon the nature of the assault, it can range anywhere between 20,000 rupees, 40,000 rupees to all the way to 2 lakhs or 3 lakhs. If the media has given sufficient coverage, then maybe within a year. But if the media hasn't given a coverage, for the trial to begin, I have seen a time frame of 3 years just for the trial to begin. And how long does it take for conviction? Anywhere between 5 years to 15 years. Fast track court is, as the name indicates, an effort made by the government to fast track some of these serious criminal cases like murder and sexual assault. But let's look at it from a slightly larger perspective. You have a fast track court and you have a POCSO act that says within 1 year of the court taking cognizance of the case, you have to complete the whole case. All that is fine. I mean, you have a fast track court also, but if the forensic science laboratory takes 18 months to come back with a test report and the court has to then start the process of reviewing evidence, obviously there is going to be delay, right? So fast track court is supposed to expedite these cases, but unless all aspects of the criminal justice machinery is equipped to be fast tracked themselves, there is really no meaning to it. As I said, I haven't really noticed a certain logic to the way the media covers these incidents, but if I have to quote some examples, instances when, for example, the child has gone to the police station, disclosed the complaint, but there is no FIR, then the media is brought into the picture either by, say, an NGO or the victim or somebody who, a well-wisher, whoever. So that time the media gets involved. If, for example, it is a subject of concern, like child protection in schools, and then there is an incident on the campus of a school, then the media can get involved. So depending upon being at the right, I think for the media it's about being at the right place at the right time, knowing the right people. And in a lot of instances it's very positive. Media involvement also means that your case gets the seriousness it deserves. So they have played a very proactive role in some of these cases. But in terms of protecting the identity of the victim, POCSO is very, very clear. Forget revealing the name or picture of the victim. You cannot even reveal the name of the locality. You cannot reveal the name of the apartment building where the child resides in. You can't reveal the name of the school where she is studying in. So what can the media report about these cases? A case of child sexual abuse has been reported in Bangalore. That is the extent to which they are allowed if you go strictly by the law. However, if the court feels that it is in the best interest of the child, like in the case of missing children, where the identity needs to be disclosed, then it can make certain provisions to that effect. If in spite of all of this, the media decides to go ahead and disclose the identity of the victim, then the Indian Penal Code, I think section 228A of the Indian Penal Code has quantum of imprisonment prescribed. So you reveal the name of the rape victim, then you're in a lot of trouble. So it is usually a matter of best practice to not venture into too many details. Also because the case is sub judice, so you don't want to prejudice the mind of the criminal justice system as to whether the person is guilty or innocent. When you discuss a concept like, say, forensic evidence, our conventional understanding is blood, hair and semen. That's the three things that come to our mind. However, forensic science as a discipline involves so many more things these days. Like for example, you can when you look at collecting forensic evidence, the priority list for the police is not just blood, semen and hair samples, but also feces, urine and a whole bunch of other things. It can also include, for example, forensic electronic evidence like the hard disk of the offender where he might have clips of child pornography. It can be the internet chat records. So when you have a case of child sexual abuse being reported to the police, the priority for them in terms of what kind of evidence they have to collect is basically a whole spectrum of objects, starting with objects in the crime scene which might have blood stains on them or hair samples on them, fingerprints on them. It has to be, it can include the offender's laptop, it can include the offender's desktop, his cell phone, the victim's cell phone, victim's laptop. So there is a wide spectrum of evidences that come within the purview of what is forensic evidence. And each of that should be a priority because for a criminal justice prosecution to be successful, as I said, there has to be substantial compliance of substantial law, procedural law and rules of evidence. This will definitely come within both rules of procedure and rules of evidence. Every criminal prosecution involves three elements. Now what are the three elements? One, there is a substantial law. What is a substantial law? A substantial law in terms of a crime is what defines the offense, right? And then there is the procedural law. How do you investigate the substantial law violation? And the third aspect is evidence. What kind of evidence is collected and what kind of evidence is admissible and how that evidence has to be collected. For a successful criminal prosecution, there should be compliance with substantial law, there should be compliance with procedural law, and there should be compliance with rules of evidence. Now, taking the case of POCSO offence being reported late, it is still an offence under the POCSO Act because what has occurred is defined as penetrative sexual assault or sexual assault. This could be even be, for example, it could be sexual intercourse with a child. Now, that is a POCSO offence regardless of when you report it. But when you look at it from the point of view of procedural law and rules of evidence, The critical thing that comes to light is the fact that you will not recover forensic evidence because the incident is reported late. Then there is a very well settled rule of criminal jurisprudence which suggests that if the complaint is lodged very late and the FIR is registered very late, that itself is a case against the prosecution. Right? So because of this, there is a difficulty with the procedural and the rules of evidence bit of it. But is it a POCSO offense? Yes. But can we make sure that there is a conviction for the POCSO offense? That depends upon the facts of the case. The Gujarat High Court, the Bombay High Court, even the Supreme Court in a number of judgments have actually held that late reporting of a case of child sexual abuse is no ground for acquittal, which means that it can still result in a conviction. But if you study some of these judgments, there was some evidence in the form of the child's testimony and hearsay evidence in the form of people to whom the child disclosed the offense, who then came to the court and said that yes, the child had disclosed this offense to us. So keeping all these things in mind, they came to a conclusion that even if you report it say 18 months later or 1 year later, there can still be a conviction. But is it a sweeping general rule? It's not. It depends upon what kind of evidence exists in the facts of each case. If you look at the minimum punishment which POCSO defines, which is for mandatory reporting, failure to mandatorily report, which is 6 months, and then there is aggravated penetrative sexual assault, which can be imprisonment for life. So the range is anywhere between 6 months to imprisonment for life, depending upon what is the nature of the offense. And what POCSO also says is that if a offense under the POCSO is also an offense under some other law, like say the Indian Penal Code, and Indian Penal Code now under specific circumstances even has death penalty prescribed for cases of rape under very specific circumstances. So if there are offenses under both POCSO and IPC, the judge is required to make a determination of which has the higher quantum of punishment and then award that quantum of punishment to the offender. Now if, for example, it is a case of a repeat offender and enormous amount of damage has been inflicted on the child by way of injuries, or the child has died because of the injuries, or permanent incapacity has resulted, then that fellow is liable for death penalty, in which case he gets death penalty and not imprisonment for life. So that's something that has to be worked out during the investigative and the trial processes. In fact, it's a very curious trend that we have seen, that when it comes to male victims, the incidence of reporting is not as high as it is with girls who report it. Even the official statistics of the Government of India report of 2007 suggests that it is 53% of boys in the country and 47% of girls who have experienced some form of sexual abuse or the other. So have I come across any case of boys who have disclosed the abuse? Not in the sense that I have worked with those boys, but in a lot of cases of juvenile offenders where the victims are young girls, if you begin to probe the background of the juvenile himself, you will notice that there is either incidents of penetrative sexual assault or other forms of sexual abuse on the boy, or he has seen pornography, which is also a form of sexual abuse. So is it happening? Yes. But do they consider it to be sexual abuse in the first place to report it? In a lot of instances, no. So in a case of say a 13 or 14-year-old boy who is in a consenting sexual relationship with say his teacher or a neighbor or his sister's friend, it is not abuse in that sense of the word in his mind. He thinks of it as a sexual experience, but does he think of it as abuse? Not yet. Since it is not sexual abuse, will he report it? The chances are no. And then there is the issue of shame. As a boy, if another man has abused you, there is tremendous amount of stigma, there is challenge to his masculine identity. So therefore, there is a lot of shame associated with it, which prevents him from coming forward. So yes, it is happening, but is it being reported to the extent that it is happening? I don't think so. This is a subject of huge controversy actually. The POCSO defines the age of consent as 18. So anybody below the age of 18 is strictly speaking incapable of consent to sexual intercourse, which is very curious because the provision of statutory rape under Indian Penal Code defines the age of consent at 16. So, some of the paradoxes that have come about is that you're capable of consent under the Indian Penal Code at the age of 17, but not capable of consent under the provisions of POCSO. And then the age of consent for marriage is 18 for girls and 21 for boys. So, if for example, under personal law, sometimes the age of puberty is a defining factor for age of consent for marriage. So what happens, for example, now under the Indian law is that a girl could technically get married when she hits the age of puberty if she belongs to the community, but she's not allowed to have sex because that will then become a POCSO offense. So there is a lot of paradoxes that the parliament has to really sit and resolve and come back with a uniform policy of what is age of consent. Now in jurisdictions abroad, they define an age gap. Now if the relationship or the age gap between the victim and the perpetrator is say beyond 3 years or beyond 5 years, then it comes within the purview of a special legislation like POCSO, where consent becomes immaterial. But if the age gap is below the specified limit, then it comes under the conventional rape legislation, where the court has to examine whether the sex was consensual or non-consensual. Now the issue right now is that since POCSO is a gender neutral enactment, meaning that the victim can be both male and female, and the perpetrator can also be male and female, if both the actors to the act of sex are below 18 years of age, they are both victims and they are both perpetrators. So it has led to a very curious predicament, and that's something that courts and the legislature will have to address going forward. So when you look at the liability of say a school management in whose campus a case of child sexual abuse occurred, there are two kinds of liability that the management immediately has to look at. One is of course liability under the criminal laws, and the other is liability under well established rules of civil law. So if you look at criminal law, you need to look at two things. One is mandatory reporting and the other is abatement. What is relevant in terms of mandatory reporting is if the management of the school or any of the person who is affiliated with the school has knowledge or apprehension that an incident of sexual abuse occurred on campus and did not then disclose it to the special juvenile police unit or the local police, they are liable for 6 months imprisonment as per the POCSO Act. That is one element. Now coming to the issue of abatement, there is one very curious provision which is called illegal omission to do a duty with the intention to facilitate the offence. Now what does this mean? Let's take the example of a teacher. Now the child has been asked to stay in detention after school hours. So she is sitting in a classroom where there is a teacher who has to supervise her. Now the offender comes to the teacher and says, look, you have a duty to be here with the child. Do one thing, at so and so time, just walk away from the class. Don't do your duty of supervising the child. And then I will go in and I will commit assault on the child. So this is the transaction between the person who is abetting the offence and the principal offender. So here the teacher has a duty to look after the child, but that duty has been omitted. What is the intention? To facilitate the offence committed by the perpetrator. In those circumstances, POCSO says that the person who has abetted the offence, like the teacher, has to be given the same punishment as the offender. So it's a very strong provision. Now as a lawyer, if I'm representing the teacher, my first defense would be to say that I just went out to drink a glass of water, my intention was not to facilitate the offence. To answer that predicament, POCSO comes in the form of section 30, which says that if any POCSO offence which requires an ingredient of mental intention that has to be proved by the prosecution, the burden is not on the prosecution. The defense or the teacher has to prove that he did not have the intention to facilitate the offence. Conventionally, it was for the prosecutor to say that the intention existed. But right now, POCSO says that no, you know what, the teacher will come and say that no, I did not have the intention to commit the offence. And he has to prove the lack of intention beyond reasonable doubt. So, school campus have a tremendous onus or responsibility right now. Now, that's just on the criminal side. If you look at the civil side of things, it's even worse for the school campus or the management. For the reason that if you look at the principle of negligence under tort law, there are two ingredients that become important. One is duty of care. So every school management has a duty of care to the children on their campus. That is well established. And then there is a failure to discharge the duty of care by their failure to ensure a protective atmosphere. In those circumstances, they will have to cough up compensation or damages. So in US, for example, if they haven't held regular sensitization programs for teachers to identify cases of abuse, schools have been made to cough up compensation. If an incident of of abuse has occurred on campus and they haven't thrown out the offender, and subsequently there's one more offense occurring, then they have been held liable. So some of this quantum of compensation has been so huge that schools have had to shut down. So under both these wide ambits, schools have to be extremely careful now, because this is an issue that's come to light and people are looking to make a few management feel responsible. If I have to reduce it in the simplest of terms, grooming is basically a carrot and stick policy. So the child is rewarded every time it responds positively to the offender's advances. This begins in a very subtle manner. Take, for example, the case of a child who probably feels neglected at home. He or she is looking for somebody to become close to, and children are naturally curious and they like attention. So when there is an offender who comes into the picture, now this is a guy who is an expert at manipulation. So he starts talking to the child about the child's problems at school, builds a rapport with the child, frequently takes the child out for lunch and dinner, showers a lot of love and attention on the child, makes the child feel very special all the time, gives a lot of gifts, fancy expensive gifts. When some cases I have noticed that the offender is successful to an extent where he creates a rift between the parents, gets the father to move out, and then swoops in to become a father figure to the child, wins the trust of the child, and then starts the process of sexual abuse. So it is a very, if I have to use one term to describe this, it's seduction. So what this seduction does is, in a lot of instances, the child begins to have positive feelings for the offender. This can be in the form of respect, empathy, love and affection. Sometimes the child even wants to marry the guy. So can we expect this child to cooperate with law enforcement in prosecuting this chap? Absolutely not. Which is why we can't just rely upon the victim's testimony, and independently we need to build a case based on forensic evidence. So this is what grooming does, and this is a huge problem because that means that the most critical piece of the whole criminal justice system, the victim, is no longer in your favor. And yes, you need to supply this context to the court, otherwise they will go by conventional rape dynamics. So I think what we are hinting at here is the tendency to blame the victim. Now this is not just specific to child sexual abuse cases. Even a simple road accident, our people tend to blame the injured party. But in the case of child sexual abuse, you need to understand a few of the dynamics that are associated with abuse. For example, grooming is one angle. When there is a power dynamic associated with the child, because you are dealing with somebody who does not have the mental faculty to really give informed consent to the act of sex. So that is the underlying reason why the courts say that, or the legislation say that, even if there is consent, it is no consent in the eye of law. So if the child has consented, for example, we need to really examine what that consent means. Is it informed consent? Is it consent based on a full appreciation of the consequences of the act? In more often than not, the answer to that is no. There is no informed consent. So can we blame the child in those circumstances? No, we need to only blame our ignorance of child psychology. Right? If you have come to a point where we say the child is to be blamed, that just means that we don't understand children. So that is one aspect. Now, in terms of the child lying, question is, what is a lie? Because according to the defense advocate, if the child originally said the incident occurred at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then during the course of the trial the child says it occurred at 6:30 in the morning, that could amount to lying. So you will never find a case where the testimony from the time it was told before the policeman till the time before it comes to the court, it is consistent. It never happens. There is always some minor discrepancies here and there. And what those minor discrepancies actually suggest is that the testimony is truthful and spontaneous, not tutored. So is there a tendency to say that the child has lied? Yes, there is, especially in cases of incest where the father is the accused. I've even heard ridiculous things like, the father must have done it by mistake. I mean, the child had tears on the vagina. That does not occur by mistake. So it's a question of how ready we are to really help the child as a society. So long as we continue to be ignorant, so long as we continue to be governed by stereotypes, and so long as we continue to be governed by a traditional approach to these cases, we will never truly work with the child in bringing these perpetrators to justice. And we have to remember that in a lot of these cases, if the perpetrator is not brought to justice, there is a chance of re-offending against some other child. So the stakes are very high. Yeah, I think when you look at the conviction rate, which is 2 cases out of 289 cases, it's not because people are not serious about these cases. It's just that there is a lot of deficit in terms of what the law enforcement needs and what it has. Like, for example, forensic science investigation requires enough and more gloves being available to the police officials. But in my training programs, police officials tell me that audit objections are raised when they use too many gloves. So that's something that has to be addressed there. You have a policeman to people ratio of 1:1000, whereas the ideal prescribed ratio is 1:220. So these guys literally are working from 4 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the night, sometimes 24 hours. They don't get enough time at home, so obviously the level of alertness cannot be very high. So in terms of the number of court halls, you have not enough special courts, you don't have enough prosecutors. So there is a whole bunch of practical difficulties that is coming in the way of improving the conviction rate. So if we can invest into that, then yes, the conviction rate can be improved upon. But there is a lot of seriousness in law enforcement. They want to do good work, but we have to make enough provisions for them to do it. And that's something that the government, the citizens of this country, and everybody has to think about. As long as the child does not report and as long as the mother does not report, we will never stop the perpetrator from reoffending. The only chance of making sure this never happens again, the only sure shot chance of making sure it never happens again, is to report it. Because if you look at it from an extremely logical point of view, if you report the offense, it may or may not result in a conviction, no doubt. But if you don't report it, 100% acquittal, right? So if you look at it purely in terms of as a logical choice, the only way to ensure safety of the child and of children at large is by reporting the offense. And that is why we need to support the victim, no doubt. But there is that responsibility on the victim's part to report it. Only then the rest of us can enter into the picture. So that is why they should still report. Absolutely. To all the persons who are not involved in any child rights related field, the one sincere request is to stay the hell away from the child. Stop asking the child what happened. Stop repeatedly asking the mother what happened. Stop making statements such as saying that, oh, the father couldn't have done this to the child, how could it have happened. Stop stereotyping, stop victim blaming. So if you can't say something good about the case, then just be silent, because none of us know what has really happened until the court comes back with the verdict. So to all the persons who are not child psychiatrists, not social workers, not lawyers, not judges, not prosecutors, not police officials, the sincere request is just be the same way you were prior to the incident coming to light. Be normal with the family, maintain the same relationship with the family. Don't punish them with all these insinuating remarks simply because they've reported. I think that's the least minimum that can be expected from the ordinary citizens out there. So far as the other aspect is concerned, it's about awareness. Read up about the subject, understand what the subject is. Realize that child protection is not to lock up the child in a room. Realize that child protection is holistic child development, where you allow the child to go out, where you allow the child to be with nature, where you allow the child to have a normal upbringing. That is what true child protection is all about, and every book on child psychiatry will tell you that. Thirdly, know your world. Who are the police? What are their powers and duties? What are the limitations? Now, what is the law on the subject? It's not, you constantly hear people saying law should be strengthened, law should be strengthened. I think the laws are already strong, but nobody has read up about it, so it's very easy to say that the laws have to be strengthened. So please acquaint yourself with the subject of who the child is, who the policeman is, and who you are in all of this. I think that is what I would say to everybody out there. I've had police officers call me when there are cases saying that, look, this is a case that's occurred. We are not fully sure of how we need to take this forward with the child, but we want to work with whoever is willing to assist us to make sure the child gets justice. I think that to me is the strongest statement about how strong the law enforcement is in its intention to do justice. So there is more interest, there is more curiosity, there is talk about enhancing forensic science capabilities. So there is a lot of good work being done to make sure that these concerns are addressed. And a simple example would be the fact that I've been traveling non-stop for the past 6 months taking classes on child sexual abuse for law enforcement. So why would the government invest into something like this unless it is serious? How you look at it makes a lot of difference. The conventional understanding is more number of rape cases in a police station, law and order system is bad. Actually, what it means is that the relationship between the civilian population and the police station in that jurisdiction is really good, because people are comfortable coming forward and talking to the policemen. So just because you see more cases in Bangalore doesn't mean that you have more number of child rapists here. It simply means that people are feeling comfortable enough to come forward and say that yes, this happened, yes, we want to do something about it. So is it a positive sign? In one way, yes, it means that we are able to support victims better, and that is why they are able to come forward. But does it mean that what is the bad thing about it? Well, we are becoming more aware of the problem, and that's not bad, that's a good thing, right? We are finally realizing that this is an issue that's among us, so now we can address it. And this is not very different from the past. Previously it would never get reported, so nobody knew. Now it's getting reported, so we are able to understand. I think the one thing that I would like to tell to the child is it's not your fault, and what we will do to help you largely depends on what you want us to do. So we are not here to rob you of your power and how your life goes forward. We're not here to tell you that, oh, you know what, your life is over. We are not here to pity you. What we're here to do is to simply tell you that, look, we know something wrong has happened to you, and it's not your fault. Tell us what we can do to help, and we will go by that.